73 years building a life of dignity, only to feel it crumble beneath the dismissive gaze of a bank teller who deemed her unworthy. Her trembling fingers clutched the envelope containing evidence of mysterious fees as her throat tightened with a mixture of anger and humiliation. The bank's fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, highlighting every wrinkle on her face as customers shifted impatiently behind her, their indifference cutting deeper than any fee ever could. As featured on Real Life Stories New, this confrontation at First Pacific Bank reveals how quickly society discards those it should cherish most. The air grew heavy with tension while Brittany Wallace, barely looking up from her keyboard, delivered corporate policy with robotic efficiency. Linda's lifetime of teaching others to stand tall meant nothing in this moment of crushing smallness, until an unexpected figure emerged from the crowd, a presence commanding attention before he even spoke a word. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The deep voice sliced through the artificial politeness, causing heads to turn and spines to straighten, as one question transformed an ordinary afternoon into something extraordinary. The silence that followed that deep, resonant question transformed the atmosphere of First Pacific Bank instantly. Time seemed to freeze as all eyes turned toward the entrance where a broad-shouldered man stood, his presence commanding attention without effort. The baseball cap he wore couldn't disguise the intensity in his eyes as he surveyed the scene before him, an elderly woman being diminished by those who should have been serving her. Branch manager Carl Jensen's confidence wavered momentarily before he attempted to regain control. His rehearsed professional smile failed to mask his irritation at being interrupted. For years, Carl had perfected a system that prioritized efficiency over empathy, profits over people. He had cultivated an environment where employees like Brittany learned quickly which customers deserved attention and which could be dismissed with practiced indifference. The man removed his cap, revealing his identity. The collective intake of breath echoed through the marble-floored lobby as recognition dawned. Vin Diesel, action star, Hollywood icon, and apparently unexpected champion of the overload, stood before them. But unlike his on-screen persona, he wasn't here with explosions and fast cars. His weapon was something far more powerful, moral clarity. Linda Carter remained frozen in disbelief, her decades of teaching experience having taught her to recognize watershed moments when they occurred. This was one. The papers documenting the mysterious fees that had been eating away at her modest pension trembled in her hands. For weeks, she had noticed the dwindling numbers in her account statements, but had dismissed it as an oversight. When she finally gathered her courage to question it, she never expected public humiliation, and certainly never imagined a Hollywood star would enter persona. Vin approached the counter with measured steps, his focus unwavering. His question wasn't just directed at Carl and Brittany. It was aimed at everyone who had stood by silently, watching Linda's dignity being stripped away. The collective shame was palpable as customers who had been scrolling through phones or staring at the ceiling suddenly found themselves participants in an unfolding drama they couldn't ignore. Carl's attempt to dismiss Vin with procedural explanations about banking policies only magnified the absurdity of the situation. His words, once wielded with such authority, now rang hollow against Vin's straightforward moral challenge. The power dynamic that had seemed so firmly established moments before was crumbling with each passing second. When Vin gently asked Linda to explain her situation, the Real Life Stories New team would later describe it as a masterclass in compassionate listening. He gave her something no one else in the bank had offered: respect. As Linda detailed the unexpected charges that had appeared in her account over the past 2 months, Vin's expression remained unchanged, but those watching closely could see the controlled anger building behind his calm demeanor. The documentation Linda provided told a story beyond her individual case. It revealed a systematic targeting of elderly account holders, those least likely to challenge the system, those most vulnerable to institutional bullying disguised as policy. Vin recognized this pattern immediately, his years in an industry known for fine-print contracts having sharpened his ability to identify exploitation. When Vin turned back to Carl, the challenge in his voice was unmistakable. He wasn't asking for special treatment for Linda. He was demanding basic decency. His request to examine Linda's account details on the computer system shifted the confrontation from personal to systemic. This was no longer about one elderly woman and a few dollars in fees. It was about institutional accountability. Carl's reluctance to display the account information publicly spoke volumes. His face, once flushed with authority, now paled with the realization that what he had dismissed as standard practice might soon be exposed as predatory. Brittany's fingers hovered over the keyboard, caught between loyalty to her boss and the awareness that she had become complicit in something indefensible. The atmosphere in the bank transformed as Vin invited other customers to share similar experiences. Hands raised tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. What had seemed like isolated incidents suddenly formed a pattern too clear to ignore. The bank's strategy of imposing small, incremental fees on accounts belonging primarily to elderly customers, fees just negligible enough to discourage individual complaints, but substantial enough in aggregate to boost quarterly profits, was laid bare. Vin's controlled anger resonated with everyone present. Not once did he raise his voice, yet his words carried more impact than any shout could have. When he pointed out that the fees disproportionately affected elderly customers, the moral bankruptcy of the practice became impossible to justify. Carl's attempts to hide behind corporate policy only highlighted his personal failure of character. The young man recording the exchange on his phone captured more than just another viral moment. He documented a fundamental truth about power and responsibility. His announcement that the video was already uploading to social media introduced another dimension to the confrontation. What happened within these walls would no longer stay contained. The court of public opinion, often unpredictable but rarely tolerant of the powerful exploiting the vulnerable, would soon render its verdict. Carl's retreat to his office marked the beginning of consequences that would extend far beyond this single encounter. The ringing phone with corporate headquarters on the line signaled that the ripples were already spreading outward. His dismissive attitude toward Linda, which had seemed so inconsequential to him an hour earlier, was now threatening everything he had built. What makes this story particularly significant, as featured on Real Life Stories New, is how it illustrates the unexpected ways accountability can arrive. Linda Carter had not come looking for a champion. She had simply wanted fairness. Her lifetime of serving others as a teacher had instilled in her a belief in systems working as they should. When that belief was shattered by Carl's callousness, she found herself unprepared for battle against an institution designed to wear down individual resistance. Vin Diesel's intervention wasn't just about celebrity power. It was about the responsibility that comes with witnessing injustice. In a society increasingly designed to make people feel powerless against large systems, his actions reminded everyone present that the choice to stand up or remain seated is always available. His fame merely amplified what any person could have done. The aftermath unfolded with the speed and force that only social media can generate. The video spread across platforms, accumulating millions of views within hours. News outlets picked up the story, framing it within larger narratives about institutional elder abuse and predatory banking practices. Hashtags demanding accountability trended nationally, then globally. First Pacific Bank's corporate headquarters, recognizing a public relations disaster unfolding in real time, moved swiftly to contain the damage. Their initial statement, carefully crafted to acknowledge concerns while admitting no wrongdoing, only fueled public outrage. The contrast between their corporate speak and Vin's straightforward moral clarity couldn't have been more stark. A more comprehensive statement followed within 24 hours, announcing an internal review of all branch practices and a commitment to refunding any improperly assessed fees. Carl Jensen was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, corporate language for we're figuring out how to fire him without admitting larger systemic issues. Brittany Wallace found herself in an unexpected position of power. Her testimony about the pressure to implement questionable fee structures would be crucial to the internal investigation. The choice between loyalty to a system that had taught her to devalue people like Linda and her own moral compass loomed large. Her hesitant apology to Linda had been a first step toward choosing the latter. For Linda, watching the story unfold from her modest apartment was surreal. The woman who had spent decades shaping young minds now found herself at the center of a national conversation about dignity and respect in our financial institutions. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests from news outlets and messages of support from former students who recognized their beloved teacher in the viral footage. The story resonated because it touched on universal experiences. Nearly everyone watching had felt small and powerless at some point when facing large institutions. The fantasy of having someone with power intervene on your behalf struck a chord across demographic lines. But beyond that vicarious satisfaction lay a more profound question about what we owe each other as members of a society. Bank auditors, responding to the corporate directive, uncovered a pattern of targeted fee increases implemented across several branches, all disproportionately affecting elderly account holders. What happened to Linda wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. It was policy, carefully designed to extract maximum profit from those deemed least likely to resist. Carl Jensen, facing the end of his banking career, shifted from denial to deflection. He wasn't responsible, he insisted to investigators. He was merely implementing directives from above. The pressure to meet quarterly targets had led to choices he might not have made otherwise. His attempt to distribute blame upward failed to address the fundamental question Vin had posed. Why had he chosen to humiliate an elderly woman who simply sought answers? The most powerful moment in this unfolding story came not from corporate announcements or viral metrics, but from a handwritten note that arrived at Linda's apartment a week after the incident. The Real Life Stories' new team would later highlight this gesture as the perfect embodiment of their channel's mission to showcase humanity's capacity for connection across divides. Vin Diesel, who could have easily moved on after his moment of intervention, took the time to write personally to Linda. His note acknowledged not his own role but her strength, reminding her that she had always possessed the power to stand up for herself. The signed movie memorabilia and personal invitation to his upcoming premiere weren't merely celebrity gestures. They were recognitions of her dignity, the very thing Carl had tried to strip away. For elderly customers across the country, the story sparked a wave of closer examinations of their own bank statements. Financial advisors reported a surge in requests for account reviews. Senior advocacy groups developed educational materials about banking rights. What had begun as one woman's quest for answers had evolved into a movement for transparency and fairness. First Pacific Bank, recognizing that superficial changes would not suffice in the face of such scrutiny, announced comprehensive reforms to their fee structures and customer service protocols. New training programs emphasizing respect for elderly customers were implemented across all branches. The financial cost of refunding improperly assessed fees across their customer base was substantial, but the cost to their reputation had been far greater. Carl Jensen's official termination came with corporate language about failure to uphold company values, a phrase that neatly avoided addressing how those values had seemed perfectly aligned with his actions until they became public. His banking career effectively over, he would later attempt to rebrand himself as a whistleblower, claiming he had been made a scapegoat for industry-wide practices. Few found this narrative convincing. Brittany Wallace, after providing testimony that helped expose the systematic nature of the fee targeting, was retained but transferred to another branch. Her journey from complicity to conscience became an unexpected subplot in the larger story. In interviews, she spoke candidly about the subtle ways workplace culture can normalize mistreatment of certain customer groups and her own process of recognizing her responsibility. For Linda Carter, the experience transformed her relationship with institutions. The teacher who had spent decades working within systems, believing in their fundamental fairness despite their flaws, now approached them with a healthy skepticism. She became an unlikely spokesperson for elder financial rights, appearing on news programs and at community events to share her experience. The young man whose quick thinking had captured the confrontation on video, Kevin Zhang, a graduate student in journalism, found his career trajectory altered by those few minutes of footage. His instinct to document the interaction had created an accountability mechanism that might otherwise have been absent. Job offers from media outlets followed, along with a new understanding of the power and responsibility that comes with bearing witness. What makes this story continue to resonate, as highlighted by Real Life Stories' new and their follow-up coverage, is how it illustrates the complex interplay between individual actions and systemic issues. Vin Diesel's intervention created a moment of clarity, but the underlying problems required collective awareness and sustained pressure to address. His celebrity provided a spotlight, but the real change came from thousands of ordinary people who recognized something familiar in Linda's experience and demanded better. In banking circles, the incident became a cautionary tale about the hidden costs of prioritizing metrics over ethics. Risk management seminars began including the First Pacific incident as a case study in how quickly reputational damage can outweigh short-term financial gains. The video footage featuring Carl's dismissive treatment of Linda was incorporated into training materials across the industry as an example of customer service failures. The letter Linda received from Vin remained on her kitchen counter for months, a tangible reminder that dignity cannot be measured in account balances. Moral clarity. When she finally attended the movie premiere as his invited guest, the photos of them together, the action star, and the retired teacher created another wave of media attention. But what photographers captured wasn't celebrity worship. It was mutual respect between two people who understood the importance of standing up for what's right. Financial regulators, responding to the increased scrutiny generated by the incident, launched broader investigations into fee structures across multiple banking institutions. Their findings revealed industry-wide patterns similar to those at First Pacific, leading to new regulatory regulatory guidelines about fee transparency and special protections for elderly account holders. What had begun with Linda's questions about a few dollars ultimately led to reforms affecting millions of customers. Carl Jensen's attempt to rebuild his career in financial services hit consistent roadblocks. The video had made him recognizable. His name synonymous with a particular kind of institutional arrogance. Job interviews inevitably included questions about the incident. And his various explanations, from denying responsibility to claiming victimhood, failed to convince potential employers that he had learned anything meaningful from the experience. Linda's former students organized a celebration in her honor, recognizing that her stand against injustice was consistent with the values she had instilled in them throughout her teaching career. The event, held in the gymnasium of the school where she had taught for over 30 years, brought together generations of people whose lives she had touched. Their stories about how she had taught them to question authority respectfully but persistently reveal that her confrontation at the bank wasn't an anomaly. It was the culmination of a lifetime of principled living. Real-life stories tracked the ripple effects of this single encounter over the following months, documenting how one moment of accountability can trigger wider systemic examination. Their follow-up feature highlighted other instances where ordinary people, inspired by Linda's story, had challenged unfair practices at their own financial institutions with newfound confidence. The nature of viral moments is their unpredictability, both in what captures public attention and in how that attention translates into real-world change. What made this particular story endure beyond its initial cycle of outrage and reaction was its perfect encapsulation of timelessness, respect for elders, standing up to bullies, the responsibility of those with power to protect those without, and capacity for dignity to prevail over humiliation. For Vin Diesel, the incident became part of his public persona in ways his carefully managed Hollywood image could never have manufactured. In subsequent interviews about upcoming film projects, journalists inevitably asked about the bank confrontation. His responses consistently redirected attention back to the larger issues of elder respect and institutional accountability, rather than centering his own role. Banking industry publications debated the implications of the incident for customer service protocols, particularly regarding elderly clients. Some institutions responded by creating specialized service tracks for senior customers, with dedicated staff trained in addressing their specific needs and concerns. Others implemented systematic reviews of their fee structures to identify and eliminate potentially predatory practices before they could become public relations disasters. Linda's kitchen table became an unlikely hub of community organizing as she hosted regular meetings for fellow seniors to discuss financial literacy and advocacy. The woman who had once felt too intimidated to effectively challenge bank fees now coached others through the process of reviewing statements, questioning charges, and demanding respect from financial institutions. Her modest pension hadn't increased, but her sense of agency and purpose had expanded immeasurably. First Pacific Bank's attempts to rebuild its reputation included hiring a senior advocate ombudsman to review policies and practices affecting elderly customers. The position, created directly in response to the incident, represented an acknowledgement that demographic-specific customer needs required specialized attention. The bank's leadership, burned by the experience, recognized that meaningful change required more than cosmetic adjustments to public relations strategies. For Brittany Wallace, the aftermath brought difficult self-reflection. In private conversations and later in an anonymous interview with a financial industry blog, she described the subtle ways in which workplace culture had shaped her perception of customers like Linda. Performance metrics that prioritized efficiency over service, casual comments from supervisors about difficult, elderly customers, and the constant pressure to move lines quickly had all contributed to her dismissive treatment of Linda. Her journey toward recognizing her own complicity became an important subplot in discussions about institutional ethics. The young man whose video documentation had created accountability, Kevin John, found himself becoming an advocate for transparency in customer service interactions. His thesis project evolved to focus on how public documentation of institutional failures could drive systemic change. The camera phone, he argued, had become one of the most powerful tools for ordinary people to challenge power imbalances in daily interactions. What real-life stories knew emphasized in their continuing coverage was how this incident had transformed not just from a viral moment to systemic change, but from an isolated confrontation to a movement. Senior citizen groups across the country organized bank statement review events where elderly customers could bring their accounts for examination by volunteer financial advisors. Dozens of similar fee structures were identified and challenged, leading to refunds totaling millions of dollars. Carl Jensen's personal journey following his termination reflected the complicated realities of accountability. Initial denial gave way to anger, then to a reluctant acknowledgement that he had failed not just in customer service but in basic human decency. In a podcast interview a year after the incident, he described the experience as a harsh but necessary awakening to how he had allowed corporate expectations to erode his moral compass. Whether this represented genuine growth or strategic rebranding remained open to interpretation. Linda's decision to use her unexpected platform to advocate for others reflected the values she had demonstrated throughout her teaching career. Rather than focusing on her personal vindication, she consistently directed attention toward the systemic issues affecting vulnerable populations in their interactions with financial institutions. Her kitchen table meetings expanded to community center gatherings, then to structured workshops on financial literacy and advocacy for seniors. Vin Diesel's continued correspondence with Linda, away from public view, spoke to the authentic connection they had formed. What had begun as a chance encounter evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect. When Linda faced health challenges the following year, Vin's private support, from ensuring she had access to quality medical care to simply checking in regularly, demonstrated that his commitment extended far beyond the viral moment that had brought them together. The banking industry's gradual implementation of Linda Carter protocols, standardized procedures for addressing elderly customer concerns with particular attention to clarity and respect, represented a rare instance of meaningful change emerging from a viral incident. These protocols, initially adopted by First Pacific as part of their damage control efforts, spread to other institutions as best practices rather than mere public relations measures. For the customers who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand, the experience prompted varying degrees of self-examination. Some became more assertive in their own interactions with institutions, while others found themselves more willing to intervene when witnessing similar situations. The bystander effect that had allowed Linda's humiliation to progress until Vin's intervention became a point of reflection. What responsibilities do we have to each other in public spaces? Linda's eventual attendance at Vin's movie premiere created another wave of media attention. But what photographers captured wasn't merely a celebrity photo opportunity. It was the visible manifestation of a principle that had resonated throughout this story. Dignity transcends social hierarchies, wealth disparities, and cultural divides. The images of the action star and the retired teacher walking the red carpet together symbolized the unexpected connections that can form when people recognize each other's fundamental worth. Real-life stories news documentary follow-up, released 1 year after the incident, traced the widespread changes that had resulted from this single confrontation. Beyond the specific reforms at First Pacific and the regulatory adjustments, the most significant impact had been on public consciousness. Elderly customers reported being treated with noticeably more respect at financial institutions, not because of mandated protocols, but because employees were more conscious of how easily dismissive treatment could now become public. The unexpected friendship between Linda and Vin continued to evolve beyond media attention. When she expressed interest in using her experience to help others, he connected her with resources to develop a foundation focused on financial literacy and advocacy for seniors. The Linda Carter Foundation, launched with seed funding from Vin and several of his industry colleagues, created educational materials and support networks specifically designed to address the challenges elderly individuals face when navigating complex financial systems. Carl Jensen's attempt to rehabilitate his professional reputation included volunteering with financial literacy programs. An ironic twist given his previous role in exploiting financial illiteracy. Whether this represented genuine atonement or strategic career management remained a subject of debate among those who followed the story. The ambiguity of his motivations highlighted a central question about accountability. Does it require inner transformation or merely behavioral compliance? Brittany Wallace's career trajectory following the incident took an unexpected turn when she decided to pursue elder law, specifically focusing on financial protection for seniors. Her first-hand experience with how institutional practices could exploit vulnerable populations gave her unique insight into both the systemic issues and the psychological factors involved. Her transition from participating engaging in problematic practices to actively working to prevent them represented one of the more hopeful narratives to emerge from the incident. The regulatory changes implemented in response to the wider investigations triggered by Linda's case created new protections for elderly banking customers nationwide. Requirements for clearer fee disclosures, prohibition of certain types of account changes without explicit customer notifications, and enhanced penalties for institutions found targeting vulnerable demographics all trace their origins back to that afternoon at First Pacific Bank. For Linda, perhaps the most meaningful outcome wasn't the policy changes or the media attention, but the restoration and amplification of her voice. The teacher who had dedicated her life to empowering young minds found herself, in retirement, empowering her peers to advocate for themselves in systems designed to minimize their concerns. The quiet dignity she had maintained even while being humiliated had ultimately proven more powerful than Carl's institutional authority. The story's continuing resonance is documented by real-life stories new in their anniversary coverage, stem from its perfect encapsulation of universal experiences. Almost everyone has felt the frustration of being dismissed by institutional representatives, the helplessness of navigating complex systems designed to discourage questions, and the longing for someone powerful to intervene on their behalf. Linda's experience provided both vicarious satisfaction and practical inspiration for confronting similar situations. What makes this particular case study so valuable for discussions about corporate ethics is how clearly it demonstrates that seemingly minor interactions can reveal profound systemic failures. Carl's dismissive treatment of Linda wasn't simply poor customer service. It was the visible manifestation of institutional priorities that had placed profit extraction above basic respect. The fee structure targeting elderly customers wasn't an oversight. It was strategy disguised as policy. Vin Diesel's intervention, while dramatically satisfying in the moment, ultimately mattered less than the accountability mechanisms that followed. His celebrity provided the initial spotlight, but the sustained pressure came from ordinary people recognizing familiar patterns in their own experiences. The transformation from isolated complaint to systemic reform happened because individual recognition became collective action. Financial education programs for seniors saw dramatic increases in attendance following media coverage of Linda's experience. Many elderly individuals who had previously accepted confusing bank statements and unexplained fees as inevitable now approach these institutions with new awareness and assertiveness. Community centers and libraries developed specialized programs addressing the specific financial challenges facing seniors, from avoiding scams to understanding digital banking. Carl Jensen's eventual public apology, delivered in a television interview 18 months after the incident, reflected the complex journey of someone forced to confront the implications of their actions. He acknowledged not just his mistreatment of Linda, but the underlying mindset that had allowed him to dismiss her concerns so easily. Whether viewers found his apology sincere or calculated, it represented an important moment of public accountability rarely seen in corporate contexts. Linda's kitchen table gatherings evolved into structured community workshops, then into a nationwide network of senior advocacy groups focused specifically on financial dignity. What had begun with one woman questioning unexplained fees had grown into a movement demanding transparency, respect, and accommodation for the specific needs of elderly customers across financial institutions. The legal implications of the case extended beyond banking regulations to broader questions about age discrimination in financial services. Class action lawsuits were filed against several major banks, alleging similar patterns of predatory fee structures targeting elderly customers. The evidence gathered during Linda's case provided crucial precedent for these wider legal challenges to institutional practices. For Brittany Wallace, the journey from complicity to advocacy included difficult public testimony about the workplace culture that had normalized mistreatment of elderly customers. Her willingness to name specific practices and pressures helped regulators identify patterns requiring intervention. Her transition from reluctant participant to active reformer illustrated how individual moral awakenings can contribute to systemic change. Real Life Stories News special feature on the second anniversary of the incident highlighted perhaps the most significant outcome, the cultural shift in how elderly customers were perceived and treated across service industries. What had once been dismissed as an acceptable form of institutional efficiency, rushing elderly customers, minimizing their concerns, exploiting their hesitance to complain, was increasingly recognized as a moral failure requiring correction. The most profound legacy of this incident, beyond specific policy changes changes or individual consequences was its contribution to a larger conversation about dignity in institutional interactions. Linda's experience provided a perfect case study in how systems designed to maximize efficiency often minimize humanity in the process. The viral moment had captured not just one woman's humiliation, but a fundamental dysfunction in how institutions engage with vulnerable populations. Linda Carter's transformation from victim to advocate represented the story's most inspiring dimension. The retired teacher who had entered the bank that day, seeking simple answers, had emerged as a powerful voice for elder dignity. Her gentle persistence, even when faced with institutional dismissal, had ultimately proven more enduring than Carl's authority or even Vin's celebrity. Her strength had never been in volume or title, but in the moral clarity that had guided her throughout her life. The friendship that formed between Linda and Vin, unlikely as it might have seemed, continued to flourish beyond media attention. Their regular correspondence and occasional public appearances together served as reminders that authentic connection can transcend the barriers of age, wealth, and social status. What had brought them together was a shared recognition of the importance of standing up for what's right, regardless of the cost. Banking industry reforms implemented in response to the incident created new standards for customer service, particularly regarding elderly clients. The Linda Carter effect, as it became known in corporate training materials, referred to the recognition that even seemingly minor disrespect toward vulnerable customers could now result in significant reputational and financial consequences. What had once been acceptable institutional behavior had been decisively redefined. For Carl Jensen, the path to redemption proved more complicated than he had anticipated. His initial attempts to distance himself from responsibility gave way to grudging acknowledgement, then to what appeared to be genuine remorse. Whether his transformation was sincere or strategic remained open to interpretation, but his public statements increasingly reflected an understanding of how his behavior had embodied larger systemic failures. The regulatory changes sparked by Linda's case created new protection mechanisms for elderly banking customers nationwide. Requirements for enhanced disclosure, prohibitions against certain types of account modifications without explicit consent, and increased penalties for institutions found targeting vulnerable populations all trace their origins back to that confrontation at First Pacific Bank. First Pacific's comprehensive reforms, implemented as part of their damage control strategy, became industry standards rather than exceptional measures. Their creation of an elder advocate position within their corporate structure, initially dismissed by competitors as an overreaction, was gradually adopted across the banking sector as best practice rather than mere public relations management. Linda's decision to use the settlement funds she received from First Pacific to establish a foundation supporting financial literacy for seniors transformed personal vindication into community empowerment. The Linda Carter Foundation developed educational materials specifically designed to address the challenges elderly individuals face when navigating complex financial systems, creating a resource that would outlast any individual viral moment. Kevin Zhang, whose documentation had created the initial accountability mechanism, built a career focused on transparency and institutional interactions. His graduate research on how public documentation can drive systemic change evolved into a broader advocacy platform promoting institutional transparency across sectors. The simple act of recording what he witnessed had altered not just his career trajectory, but his understanding of citizen responsibility. Real Life Stories News' third anniversary feature focused on the unlikely heroes who had emerged throughout his story. Linda, whose quiet dignity had proven more powerful than institutional authority. Kevin, whose instinct to document had created crucial accountability. Brittany, whose journey from complicity to conscience illustrated the possibility of moral growth. And countless others who had recognized their own experiences in Linda's and transformed that recognition into action. Banking executives across the industry cited the First Pacific incident in strategy discussions about customer service protocols, particularly regarding vulnerable demographics. What had once been dismissed as acceptable sacrifice of customer experience for operational efficiency was increasingly recognized as both ethically problematic and strategically risky in an era of instant documentation and social media accountability. The Linda Carter Foundation's expansion to include legal advocacy for elderly victims of financial exploitation represented another dimension of the incident's lasting impact. What had begun with questioning unexplained fees had evolved into a comprehensive approach to protecting elderly financial dignity across multiple fronts, from education to regulatory reform to legal representation. Carl Jensen's eventual career transition to ethics consulting represented either profound personal transformation or strategic adaptation to change circumstances, depending on one's perspective. His first first-hand experience with the consequences of ethical failure positioned him uniquely to speak to corporate audiences about the hidden costs of prioritizing metrics over morality. Whether his insights stem from genuine reflection or professional necessity remain an open question. For Linda, the most meaningful outcome wasn't the policy changes, media attention, or even the foundation bearing it. It was the restoration of her voice, the recognition that her concerns mattered, that her dignity was non-negotiable, and that her lifetime of treating others with respect entitled her to the same consideration. The retired teacher who had entered the bank seeking simple answers had emerged as a powerful advocate for those whose voices often go unheard. The lasting friendship between Linda and Vin, documented occasionally in media coverage but mostly maintained privately, served as a reminder that authentic connection can transcend the artificial divisions of celebrity, age, and circumstance. What had brought them together wasn't calculation or obligation, but a shared recognition of fundamental human worth, the understanding that dignity isn't earned through status but inherent in existence. Banking regulators, responding to the increased scrutiny generated by the incident, implemented industry-wide reviews of fee structures and customer service protocols specifically affecting elderly clients. Their findings revealed patterns similar to those at First Pacific across numerous institutions, leading to broader reforms and enhanced protections that would benefit millions of customers who would never know the origin story behind these changes. Brittany Wallace's transition from reluctant participant in problematic practices to active advocate for reform illustrated the complex moral journey of recognizing one's own complicity in systemic harms. Her testimony about the workplace pressures and cultural norms that had shaped her behavior provided crucial insight for regulators seeking to address root causes rather than merely symptoms of institutional dysfunction. First Pacific Bank's comprehensive transformation, from implementing elder-specific service protocols to establishing review mechanisms for fee structures, represented a rare instance of corporate reform extending beyond public relations management to substantive operational change. The financial costs of these reforms were substantial, but the reputational costs of failing to implement them had proven far greater. The cultural conversation sparked by the incident extended beyond banking to broader questions about how societies treat their elderly members across institutional contexts. What Linda had experienced wasn't unique to financial services, but reflective of widespread tendencies to dismiss, rush, or minimize older individuals in medical, governmental, and commercial settings. Her story had provided a perfect case study for examining these larger patterns of institutional ageism. Kevin Zhang's documentary project, developed from his original footage and subsequent interviews, created a powerful educational tool for discussions about institutional ethics and individual responsibility. His exploration of the complex ecosystem that had allowed Linda's mistreatment, from corporate pressure for efficiency to cultural devaluation of the elderly, provided nuanced insight into how good people can become complicit in harmful systems. Real-life stories news continuing coverage emphasized the story's evergreen relevance as a case study in both institutional failure and the power of individual action. Their four-part series examining the incident from multiple perspectives, Linda's personal journey, the institutional dynamics at First Pacific, the regulatory response, and the broader cultural implications, provided a comprehensive framework for understanding how single interactions can reveal systemic dysfunctions. For the banking industry, the incident became a watershed moment in customer service philosophy, particularly regarding vulnerable demographics. The recognition that operational efficiency gained through dismissive treatment of certain customer groups carried hidden costs, both moral and financial, led to widespread reevaluation of performance metrics and service protocols. The Linda Carter effect entered industry vocabulary as shorthand for the reputational risks of prioritizing procedures over people. Linda's regular speaking engagements at senior centers, community organizations, and financial literacy programs transformed her from reluctant participant in a viral moment to purposeful advocate for systemic change. Her effectiveness stemmed not from technical expertise, but from the moral clarity with which she articulated fundamental principles. That dignity doesn't diminish with age, that questions deserve answers, and that institutions exist to serve people rather than the reverse. Carl Jensen's gradual journey from defensive denial to apparent acceptance of responsibility reflected the complicated reality of individual accountability within systemic contexts. His eventual acknowledgement that he had allowed corporate expectations to erode his moral compass resonated with many who recognized similar pressures in their own professional lives. Whether his transformation was genuine or strategic, his story provided an important counterpoint to Linda's in discussions about institutional ethics. The regulatory reforms implemented in response to the wider investigations triggered by Linda's case created new protections for vulnerable banking customers nationwide. Requirements for enhanced disclosure, prohibitions against certain types of account modifications without explicit consent, and increased penalties for institutions found targeting vulnerable populations all traced their origins back to that confrontation at First Pacific Bank, though most beneficiaries would never know the story behind these protections. First Pacific's creation of an elder advocate position within their corporate structure, initially dismissed by competitors as an overreaction, gradually became standard practice across the banking sector. This institutional recognition that elderly customers have specific needs requiring specialized attention represented a significant shift from the efficiency-focused approach that had characterized previous service models. For Brittany Wallace, the journey from complicity to advocacy included difficult public testimony about the workplace culture that had normalized her treatment of elderly customers. Her willingness to name specific practices and pressures helped regulators identify patterns requiring intervention. Her transition from reluctant participant to active reformer illustrated how individual moral awakening could contribute to systemic change. Linda's decision to use her unexpected platform to help others reflected the values she had demonstrated throughout her teaching career. Rather than focusing on personal vindication, she consistently directed attention toward the systemic issues affecting vulnerable populations in their interactions with financial institutions. The Linda Carter Foundation's educational materials and advocacy networks created resources that would outlast any individual viral moment. The unexpected friendship between Linda and Vin continued to evolve beyond media attention. Their occasional public appearances together served as powerful visual reminders that dignity transcends social hierarchies, wealth disparities, and cultural divides. The images of the action star and the retired teacher at community events and fundraisers symbolize the authentic connections that can form when people recognize each other's fundamental worth. Banking executives across the industry cited the First Pacific incident in strategy discussions about customer service protocols, particularly regarding vulnerable demographics. What had once been dismissed as acceptable sacrifice of customer experience for operational efficiency was increasingly recognized as both ethically problematic and strategically risky in an era of instant documentation and social media accountability. For Kevin Zhang, whose documentation had created the initial accountability mechanism, the experience transformed his understanding of citizen responsibility in institutional contexts. His graduate research on how public documentation can drive systemic change evolved into a broader advocacy platform promoting transparency across sectors. The simple act of recording what he witnessed had altered not just his career trajectory, but his conception of moral obligation. Real Life Stories News' 5th anniversary special focused on the ripple effects of the incident across multiple domains, from regulatory reform to corporate training to elderly advocacy networks. Their comprehensive analysis illustrated how single interactions can reveal systemic dysfunctions and, under the right circumstances, catalyze meaningful change. The incident had become a perfect case study in both institutional failure and the power of individual action. Days turned into weeks, and Linda Carter's story continued to unfold in ways none could have predicted. The morning she received Vin Diesel's handwritten note marked a turning point, not just in her personal journey, but in how she viewed her own power. As she traced her fingers over his words, "You didn't need me to stand up for you. You already had the strength," something profound awakened within her. The signed Fast and Furious poster and premiere invitation weren't merely celebrity gestures. They represented acknowledgement of her worth, the very dignity Carl had attempted to strip away. But Linda understood something deeper now. True strength isn't measured by who stands beside you in moments of conflict, but by the courage to stand at all. When the Linda Carter Foundation launched 6 months later, its mission wasn't about banking regulations or fee structures. It focused on something far more fundamental, teaching elderly citizens that their voices matter. The retired schoolteacher found herself once again in a classroom of sorts, but this time her students were peers who had spent decades being systematically silenced by institutions designed to wear them down. At a community center in downtown Los Angeles, Linda stood before a room of seniors, her posture straight, her voice clear. Before that day at the bank, she told them, "I believe dignity was something others could take from me. Now I understand it's something we carry within." The room filled with knowing nods. These were people who recognized their own experiences in her words. First Pacific Bank's corporate reforms continued to ripple through the industry. The Linda Carter Protocol became standard training in financial institutions nationwide, a testament to how one woman's refusal to accept dismissal could transform systems built to discourage resistance. But the true transformation wasn't in corporate policy manuals. It lived in the everyday interactions between tellers and elderly customers, where respect had replaced expediency. When Linda finally attended Vin Diesel's movie premiere, photographers captured something remarkable, not a celebrity with a fan, but two individuals connected by mutual respect. Their friendship, unlikely as it seemed, continued to flourish away from public view. They recognized in each other a shared understanding that standing up for what's right isn't reserved for Hollywood scripts or exceptional circumstances. It's a choice available to everyone, every day. Carl Jensen's journey proved more complicated. After his termination, he struggled to rebuild his career, finding every door closed by the viral video that had captured his true character. Months of reflection and therapy led him to a humbling realization. His failure wasn't in customer service protocols, but in basic humanity. In a public statement that surprised many, he acknowledged, "I lost sight of the people behind the numbers." What happened to Mrs. Carter revealed not just my professional failings, but my personal ones. The Real Life Stories new team followed Linda's journey for 2 years, documenting how a single moment of conflict had transformed not just banking policies, but an entire conversation about dignity and aging. Their documentary special, The Woman Who Changed Banking, revealed something powerful. Linda's strength had always been there. It didn't arrive with Vin Diesel. It had built steadily through decades of teaching, parenting, and navigating life's challenges. In the final scene of that documentary, Linda sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by letters from elderly people across the country sharing similar stories of institutional dismissal and newfound courage to challenge it. Each morning now, she told the camera, her eyes bright with purpose, "I wake up knowing I have work to do. Not for myself, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel small by those with power." This is where the true power of Linda's story resides. It isn't about a Hollywood star intervening in a moment of injustice, though that makes for compelling viewing. It's about how ordinary courage can transform systems designed to exploit vulnerability. It's about the strength that lives within each of us, waiting for the moment we decide enough is enough. Linda Carter entered First Pacific Bank that afternoon, seeking answers about a few dollars in unexplained fees. She left with something far more valuable: the rediscovery of her own voice. And in sharing that journey with us, she offers a profound reminder that dignity isn't determined by age, wealth, or status. It's our birthright, one worth defending. If Linda's story resonated with you, we invite you to join our community at Real Life Stories New. Our mission is simple: to share authentic human experiences that remind us of our shared humanity and capacity for courage. With your support, we can reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers and continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. Have you ever stood up against injustice or witnessed someone else's courage in challenging moments? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire others to find their voice, just as Linda found hers. Subscribe to Real Life Stories New for more powerful human journeys that remind us what truly matters. Like and share this video to help others discover that sometimes the most extraordinary courage comes from the most ordinary moments. Remember Linda's words, dignity isn't something others can take from you. It's something you carry within. In a world that often makes us feel powerless, this might be the most important truth of all.
The moment the airline attendant refused David Lawson's business class ticket, something inside him snapped. He could feel the eyes of every passenger in the terminal burning into his back, watching as he, a black CEO, was being denied his rightful seat because of how he looked. With calculated precision, David reached for his phone instead of surrendering to humiliation. "That won't be necessary," he stated calmly, his composed exterior masking the storm brewing within. The white businessman behind him smirked, adjusting his cheap tie while the attendant crossed her arms defensively. David's thoughts raced through memories of countless similar encounters, moments when his appearance trumped his achievements. As featured on Real Life Stories New last month, these subtle confrontations happen daily to successful minorities across America. The airline attendant's desk phone rang, shattering the tense silence. Her face transformed from smug confidence to sheer panic as she listened to the voice on the other end. What she didn't realize was that David wasn't just any passenger. He was about to deliver a masterclass in consequences that would change company policy forever. David's phone call created an immediate shift in the atmosphere. The once bustling terminal seemed to freeze as passengers watched the confrontation unfold. The attendant's expression morphed from irritation to confusion as she answered her desk phone. "Yes, this is the check-in desk for Flight 308 to London," she stated professionally. Within seconds, her confident demeanor crumbled. Her face drained of color as she processed the information coming through the line. "I understand," she stammered, glancing nervously at David. Her hands visibly trembled as she placed the receiver down. David tucked his phone away and adjusted his impeccable cuff links. "You were saying something about me not belonging in business class?" The businessman who had been gloating moments earlier shifted uncomfortably. Several passengers began recording the interaction, sensing the dramatic power reversal taking place. A young black woman nearby couldn't suppress her satisfied smile as she held up her phone, documenting what was about to become a viral moment. The attendant frantically clicked through her computer system, her eyes widening at the information displayed on her screen. The flashing alert revealed what she had failed to recognize. David Lawson, Chief Executive Officer of Global Airlines, the very company she worked for. I didn't realize," she whispered, mortification coloring her features. David nodded slowly. "No, you didn't." The businessman who had been so smug just moments before gripped his suitcase handle with white knuckles. "CEO. That can't be right. Would you like me to prove it?" David asked calmly. As if orchestrated, the airport's digital monitors simultaneously displayed an announcement. Effective immediately, Global Airlines reaffirms its commitment to exceptional service and inclusivity. Discrimination has no place in our company. Murmurs rippled through the growing crowd of spectators. The businessman swallowed hard, looking frantically between David, the horrified attendant, and the monitors broadcasting what appeared to be a real-time corporate response. "Looks like corporate is watching," David observed. His voice measured despite the thundering victory in his chest. The attendant opened and closed her mouth repeatedly, struggling to find words. David remained composed, his steady gaze fixed on her. "You assumed I didn't belong because of how I look," he stated. "Not because of my ticket. Not because of policy. Just because of your preconceptions." "Sir, Mr. Lawson, I deeply apologize," she stammered. David raised his hand, stopping her. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to every person who's ever been dismissed, disrespected, or devalued because someone assumed they weren't good enough." The businessman suddenly grabbed his luggage. "I'll just, board now," he muttered, practically sprinting toward the gate. David allowed himself a small smile. "That's what I thought." The terminal had transformed. People who had previously ignored or dismissed David now regarded him with newfound respect and admiration. Some passengers nodded approvingly. Others whispered among themselves about what they were witnessing. The attendant's fingers flew across her keyboard in desperation, confirming what she already knew. She had made a career-altering mistake. You're Mr. Lawson. The David Lawson?" she asked, voice barely audible. "Oh, so now you know my name," David replied, his tone revealing the absurdity of the situation. The businessman, now attempting to quietly escape the scene, froze when David's gaze found him again. His previous bravado evaporated instantly, replaced by unmistakable panic. He mumbled something about taking another flight before disappearing into the crowd. Meanwhile, airport security approached, responding to the commotion. The attendant gripped the counter for support, her professional composure completely shattered. "Mr. Lawson, I deeply apologize," she pleaded, genuine fear in her eyes. David's voice remained firm yet controlled. "Apologies don't undo the bias in your actions. If I were anyone else, this incident would have been brushed aside. But you didn't expect your actions to have consequences. A corporate executive, clearly having rushed from the upper floors, arrived breathless at the counter. He looked between David and the terrified attendant before stepping forward. "Mr. Lawson, we are so sorry for this incident. Please allow us to make things right." David raised an eyebrow. "Oh, don't worry. I'm about to." The terminal fell into stunned silence as security approached. The businessman, previously reveling in his perceived superiority, now stood with downcast eyes as an officer escorted him away from the gate area. The attendant clutched the counter, her voice breaking. "Mr. Lawson, please. I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to what?" David interrupted, his words measured. "Assume that a black man in a suit couldn't possibly belong in first class? That someone like me couldn't be running the very airline you work for?" His question hung in the air, undeniable and uncomfortable. "Please, sir," she whispered, desperation evident. "I made a mistake. I need this job." David exhaled slowly, considering her words. "Maybe next time you'll remember that professionalism is more than just wearing a uniform. It's how you treat people." He stepped closer, his tone calm but final. "You thought you had the power here, but today you learned who really does." With a subtle nod to security, the attendant was led away from the counter. David turned toward the airline executive who stood nearby, still catching his breath. "Now," David said smoothly, "I assume you understand that this isn't just about me." The executive nodded vigorously. "Absolutely, sir. This behavior is completely unacceptable. We will conduct immediate training for all staff to prevent anything like this from happening again." David's expression remained serious. "We're not stopping at training." He gestured toward the crowd, many still recording with their phones. "Every person here witnessed why your customer service standards need a complete overhaul. Consider this your first and only warning. I expect a full internal review, and I'll personally oversee it." The executive swallowed hard. "Understood, sir." Satisfied with the response, David collected his boarding pass and headed toward his rightful first-class seat. As he walked through the terminal, several passengers nodded respectfully. A few even applauded his handling of the situation. Once aboard, a different flight attendant approached him nervously. "Mr. Lawson, would you like a drink before takeoff?" David settled into his luxurious seat, finally allowing himself to relax. "Yes," he replied, "and make sure it's the finest on board." The energy throughout the aircraft had completely transformed. The once dismissive airline staff now scrambled to provide impeccable service, their faces reflecting a mixture of nervousness and forced politeness. Even the captain emerged from the cockpit, adjusting his hat as he approached David with an apologetic smile. "Mr. Lawson," the captain said, extending his hand, "we sincerely regret the treatment you received today. Please allow us to personally ensure your comfort for the duration of this flight." David accepted the handshake but didn't return the insincere pleasantries. Instead, his attention drifted to the economy section where an older black gentleman sat in a modest but well-pressed suit, quietly reading a newspaper. "Actually," David said, "there is something you can do." The captain and attendants tensed, awaiting his request. "Upgrade that man to my original first-class seat." The entire cabin fell silent. After a moment of hesitation, the attendants moved quickly to carry out his instruction, approaching the older gentleman with hushed explanations. The man appeared genuinely confused. "What? There must be some mistake. I didn't request an upgrade." "No mistake, sir," the attendant explained nervously. "Mr. Lawson has requested that you take his first-class seat." The older man looked up, meeting David's gaze across the cabin. For a moment, he simply stared, processing the gesture. Then slowly, he rose from his seat, adjusted his jacket, and made his way toward the front of the plane. As he approached, David stood to greet him. "I figured you might appreciate the extra comfort." The older man clasped David's hand firmly, his eyes reflecting deep understanding. "I appreciate that, son. More than you know." David watched as the man settled into his new seat, his rightful seat, before returning to his executive suite. Another attendant approached, her posture straight, her tone respectful. "Mr. Lawson, may we offer you anything else before takeoff?" David exhaled as he settled back, completely at ease now in the plush accommodation that moments ago others had tried to deny him. "Yes," he replied with a satisfied expression. "Just a smooth flight." As the plane soared into the sky, David knew that justice had not only been served, it had been witnessed. By morning, his name would be everywhere, and his actions would spark necessary conversations about recognition, respect, and the subtle biases that persist even in spaces of privilege. In his penthouse office the next day, David scrolled through countless media reports of the incident. Videos had racked up millions of views overnight, with social media ablaze with discussions. Some called it poetic justice. Others described it as a masterclass in accountability. His assistant Taylor entered with a knowing smile. "You're trending everywhere, boss. Looks like you made quite the statement." David set his phone down. "I wasn't trying to go viral. I was ensuring people understand that respect isn't optional. It's mandatory." "Well, that flight attendant definitely learned her lesson," Taylor remarked. "I hear the airline is already implementing new diversity training following the incident." David raised an eyebrow. "Good, but real change isn't about training. It's about who makes the decisions." Taylor nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of which, I looked into that older gentleman you upgraded. Turns out he's a retired professor who spent decades teaching business ethics." David smiled genuinely. "Now that's exactly the kind of person who belongs in first class." "So you really just gave up your seat for him?" Taylor asked. David took a sip of his coffee, gazing out at the city skyline through his floor-to-ceiling windows. Respect isn't just about money or position. It's about recognizing dignity in everyone and ensuring the right people get treated right. Taylor shook her head in admiration. "I bet that airline worker regrets everything now." "Lesson learned," David replied softly. Beyond his window, the city continued its relentless pace, but one thing was certain. The next time someone like him walked into an airport, staff would think twice before deciding who belonged where. 1 month after the incident, Global Airlines unveiled its revolutionary Respect First initiative. David sat at the head of the boardroom as executives presented data showing a 78% decrease in discrimination complaints across all terminals. "This isn't just about policies," David explained to the assembled leadership team. "It's about recognizing that power comes with responsibility. When we remain silent, we become complicit." He glanced at the framed photo on his desk, himself standing alongside Professor Williams, the retired ethics teacher he'd upgraded that day. They'd since formed an unexpected friendship, collaborating on mentorship programs for minority business students. What started as one man's stand against discrimination had sparked a movement throughout the industry. Other airlines adopted similar protocols, citing global success as their blueprint. David still flew regularly, but something fundamental had shifted. The respect he received wasn't born from fear of consequences, but from genuine understanding that dignity belongs to everyone regardless of appearance. As he boarded his next flight, an attendant greeted him warmly, the same young black woman who had recorded his confrontation months earlier. "Thank you," she whispered. "You changed everything." Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from unexpected moments. If this story resonated with you, help us reach others by hitting the like button and subscribing to Real Life Stories New. We're working toward 10,000 subscribers who believe in the power of shared experiences. Your support means we can continue bringing these important narratives to light. Emily's trembling fingers froze mid-air as the sharp crack of Richard's palm against her cheek echoed through the elegant dining room, stunning their guests into silence. The sting blazed across her skin, but the real fire ignited deep within her soul, a dormant volcano finally erupting after years of suppression. Standing tall amid the shocked faces of Richard's family, she smoothed her navy dress and smiled with a newfound clarity that terrified everyone at the table. "Well," she said, her voice steady despite the crimson mark forming on her face. "I suppose the show has finally started." The Calloway family dinner party, meticulously prepared by Emily for her husband's parents' anniversary, had transformed into a watershed moment that would soon become one of the most powerful testimonies of self-worth featured on real-life stories new. Margaret Calloway's pearls seemed to dim as she witnessed her son's mask slip, revealing the man Emily had endured behind closed doors for years. Every carefully folded napkin, every precisely placed silverware piece, every bite of her grandmother's oxtail stew that they had silently judged, all of it crystallized into this single moment of awakening. Emily no longer saw a room full of intimidating judges, but merely people who had borrowed too much of her power for far too long. "I hope," she continued with the quiet dignity that comes only from reaching your breaking point, "that everyone enjoyed their dinner." And with those words, Emily turned away from the life she'd been slowly vanishing from, leaving everyone at the table to digest something far heavier than her cooking. The dining room stood frozen in time as Emily's declaration hung in the air. Margaret Calloway's pearl necklace caught the chandelier light while Richard's brothers and their wives exchanged uncomfortable glances across the polished oak table. No one moved to help her. No one spoke a word of objection. Their collective silence became as deafening as Richard's outburst had been shocking. Emily observed them all with new eyes. For years she had sought their approval, meticulously selecting recipes that balanced Southern tradition with her own heritage, arranging wildflowers among the magnolias to soften the centerpiece, ensuring each fork aligned perfectly with invisible standards set long before she entered the Calloway mansion. But now, with the sting of Richard's hand still burning her cheek, she recognized the futility of her efforts. "Emily!" Richard's voice broke through the silence, strained and suddenly uncertain. "Don't start." The familiar warning that had quieted her countless times before now rang hollow. Something fundamental had shifted inside her, a door unlocking to reveal strength she'd forgotten was there. "No, Richard," she replied, her voice steady but simmering with newfound resolve. "I won't be quiet just because it makes the room more comfortable." Murmurs rippled across the table as all eyes turned to Richard. They were waiting, Emily realized. Waiting for him to reassert control, to restore the careful veneer of civility that had always masked the dysfunction beneath. And in their expectant gazes, she saw complicity. "You know," Emily said, addressing the entire table with quiet dignity, "I used to wonder what it would take to make you see me, to really see me. And now I know." Her eyes flashed with clarity. "But you still won't, will you?" Richard's silence answered her question more honestly than words ever could. Emily felt something within her unravel. Years of restraint, fear, and self-doubt giving way to certainty. This moment, painful as it was, had granted her permission to claim what she denied herself for too long. The right to exist beyond the narrow confines of others' expectations. "This," she said, sweeping her hand across the meticulously prepared table, "is the last time. The last dinner, the last show, the last time you get to decide what I swallow and what I don't." With graceful finality, Emily placed her napkin beside her plate, smoothing it with deliberate care. The simple gesture carried the weight of a declaration. She rose, the scrape of her chair against hardwood floor slicing through the silence. The hallway felt different as she walked away. Cooler, lighter somehow. Behind her, she could hear the muffled chaos erupting in her wake. Chairs scraping, voices rising, Richard calling her name. But Emily continued forward, each step measured and purposeful. She wasn't running, she was choosing. When Richard caught up to her on the staircase, his breathing was ragged, his composure fractured. "Emily, wait," he demanded, his voice straining for the authority it had always commanded. "You're making a scene." Emily turned slowly, facing him with newfound clarity. "No, Richard. You made the scene. I simply chose not to fade into the background of it." His jaw tightened. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "Stop," she interrupted, the single word landing with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Just stop." The air between them thinned to a thread. For once he did. "I have spent this entire marriage making myself small," Emily continued, her voice steady despite the emotion building beneath it. I've learned to smile when they mocked me, to stay quiet when they dismissed me. I told myself it was love, that it was sacrifice, that one day they would see me, or you would. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't falter. But the only person I made invisible was myself. Richard's expression contorted with something between desperation and disbelief. Emily, no. But she wouldn't let him finish. She was done letting him finish. I thought if I played the part well enough, if I cooked their meals, folded their linens, laughed at their jokes, if I swallowed enough, they'd let me belong. Her eyes, burning with clarity, met his unwavering gaze. But you taught me something tonight, Richard. You taught me that I don't belong here. I never did. Because belonging isn't something you earn by breaking yourself into smaller pieces. It's something you claim by standing whole. She paused, her breath shallow but sure. And I'm done shrinking for a place that was never meant to hold me. Richard's hands clenched at his sides. His voice rough with fear disguised as authority. You're not leaving. We're not doing this. Emily's answer came as unmovable as stone. Yes, we are. A flash of panic crossed his features. What about the guests? What about? I don't care, she said, the words falling with surprising ease. Let them talk. Let them stare. They've spent years watching me fade. Tonight they can watch me walk away. Richard stepped forward, his voice softening to something pleading. Emily, please don't do this. We can fix it. Her gaze remained unwavering, yet there was something in it he couldn't grasp. Something distant, something already gone. We, she repeated softly, tasting the word one final time. We ended the moment your hand touched my face. The heavy silence that followed wasn't strained or uncomfortable, but the resolute quiet of something irrevocably broken. Emily turned toward their bedroom. I'm packing my things, she stated simply. And tomorrow I'm leaving. For good. Behind her, Richard's voice broke into the air like a splintering fault line. Emily! But she was already walking through hallways that had once caged her. Past paintings of ancestors who had never seen her as anything but out of place, beyond the invisible boundaries of a life that had never truly been hers. In the bedroom, she closed the door behind her. The familiar space, once a sanctuary, then a prison, felt oddly neutral now, stripped of the power it once held. Emily reached for her closet, fingers brushing against fabrics that had always felt like costumes. Dresses for parties where her voice was merely accessory, gowns for dinners where her presence was tolerated but never welcomed. She began to pack, not with the frenzy of escape but with the care of finality. She wasn't fleeing, she was leaving. There is a difference. One measured not in haste but in clarity. From beyond the closed door, she heard footsteps pacing, muffled arguments, Richard's voice rising then falling into a silence that told her he had no more weapons to wield, no more lines to hold. And then came the sound of the front door closing as the guests finally departed. The audience dismissed from a performance they never expected to witness. Emily paused, her hand resting on a framed photograph from their wedding day. She studied the image, herself frozen in time, smiling in white, wide-eyed with hope and promise. She searched that face, that woman. She didn't hate her, she mourned her. With gentle reverence, she set the frame face down and zipped her final bag. The sound was clean, sharp, absolute. A marriage sealed over years of dinners and silences ended not with a fight but with a decision. Goodbye, she whispered, not to Richard, not to the Calloways, but to the woman she would never be again. When Emily stepped outside the Calloway estate, the night air felt like a forgotten friend against her skin. The grand facade loomed behind her, bathed in soft porch light, its towering columns standing like sentinels over a history she no longer belonged to. She had done it. She was leaving. The thought should have terrified her, yet the fear and doubt were nowhere to be found. Instead, a strange calm enveloped her as she reached her car, pressing the key fob with steady fingers. The house door burst open. Emily, wait. Richard's voice, raw and desperate, cut through the darkness. She didn't rush to escape him. Instead, she faced him with the same quiet dignity that had guided her all evening. You can't just leave, he said, his voice sharp yet cracking at the edges. Not like this. Emily tilted her head slightly. Like what, Richard? He gestured vaguely, hands clenching at his sides. Like you're walking out of a dinner party instead of our marriage. I am walking out, she replied plainly. And I'm not coming back. His breath caught. He stepped forward, but she held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. This isn't a fight, Richard, she continued, her voice calm and final. I'm not leaving to punish you. I'm leaving because I should have done it a long time ago. Something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, perhaps, but buried beneath pride he couldn't relinquish. We've had arguments before, but we work through them. Work through them. A bitter smile ghosted across her lips. You hit me tonight, Richard. The words, spoken plainly and factually, sent a visible ripple through him. His throat bobbed with a hard swallow. I don't, he began. Don't say you didn't mean it, she interrupted. Don't tell me it was the heat of the moment or that you lost control. Because it wasn't the first time you raised your voice at me. It wasn't the first time you made me feel small. She paused, letting the truth sink in. And if I stay, it won't be the last. The admission settled between them, heavy and